Corydon by André Gide. First dialogue. A sensational trial in the year 19 blank brought up once again the complicated and troublesome question of homosexuality. For a short while it was the sole topic of conversation. I grew tired of listening to the theories and observations of ignorant, bigoted fools, and I wanted to clarify my own ideas. Realizing that the right to condemn or condone lay with reason and not with sentiment, I decided to go and interview Corydon. I had heard that he did not protest against certain unnatural tendencies of which he was accused. I wanted to learn the right of the case and find what he had to say in justification. It was 10 years since I had last seen Corydon. At that time he was a high-spirited boy, generous, friendly, gentle, and proud, whose bearing even then commanded a certain respect. He had been a brilliant medical student, and his early work had won high approval in professional circles. After leaving the lycée, where we had been fellow students, we continued a long time to be fairly close friends. Then we were separated by several years of travel, and when I returned to live in Paris, the reputation which his habits were beginning to earn him kept me from seeing him. On entering his apartment, I had none of the unpleasant impressions I feared I must expect. At the same time, Corydon's own appearance was most correct, with even a trace of studied austerity. I searched his room in vain for those unmistakable signs of effeminacy, which experts claim they invariably discern in everything connected with homosexuals. However, I did notice, over the mahogany desk, a large photographic copy of Michelangelo's Creation of Man, in which Adam is depicted lying naked on the primeval slime, his hand stretched in obedience to God's finger, and his eyes raised in dazzled recognition of his presence. Corydon's professed interest in works of art would have sheltered him, had I expressed any surprise at the special subject he had chosen. On his work table stood the portrait of an old man with a long white beard, which I immediately recognized as the American, Walt Whitman, because it had appeared at the beginning of his translated works, which had just been produced by Monsieur Bazalgette. Monsieur Bazalgette had also published a biography of the poet, which I had recently come across and which I now used as a gambit for opening the discussion. 1. After reading Bazalgette's book, I can see no good reason why this portrait should be on display. My remark was impertinent. Corydon pretended not to understand, but I insisted. One still has to admire Whitman's work, he replied, however one chooses to interpret his morals. You must admit, however, that your admiration for Whitman has somewhat diminished, since Bazalgette showed that his morals were not such as you had previously been pleased to ascribe to him. Your friend Bazalgette has shown absolutely nothing. All his reasoning depends on a syllogism, which can equally well be reversed. As his major premise, he states that homosexuality is an unnatural tendency. But Whitman was in perfect health. He was, properly speaking, the most perfect example presented in literature of the natural man. Therefore, Whitman was not a homosexual. That seems to me an inescapable conclusion. But there are sections of his work where Bazalgette vainly attempts to translate the word love by amitié or affection, and sweet by pur, since Whitman is addressing a comrade. Yet the fact nevertheless remains that all the passionate, sensual, tender, and fervent passages of his poems belong to the same order, that order which you call unnatural. I do not call it an order at all, but let's hear your own syllogism. Here it is. Whitman can be taken as an example of the normal man. But Whitman was a homosexual. Therefore, homosexuality is normal. Splendid. Now, it only remains to prove that Whitman was a homosexual, but since it's a question of begging the question, I still prefer Bazalgette's syllogism. It conflicts with common sense. The essential thing is not to avoid conflicting with common sense, but to avoid warring with the truth. I'm preparing an article on Whitman, an answer to Bazalgette's arguments. You devote a lot of attention to these questions of morals? Yes, quite a lot, I admit. I'm even preparing a fairly important study on the subject. Aren't the works of Moll, Krafft-Ebing, and Rafalovich enough for you? They are not satisfactory. I would like to approach it differently. I have always thought it best to refer to these things as little as possible, and that often they only exist because some clumsy person discloses them. Furthermore, it is in bad taste to speak of them because there will always be some good-for-nothing who wants to practice precisely those things of which he pretends to disapprove. I do not pretend to disapprove. There is a rumor that you pose as being tolerant. You simply do not understand me. I see I must tell you the title of my work. Please do. I am writing a defense of homosexuality. Why not a eulogy while you are about it? Because such a title would force my ideas. I'm afraid that some people will find even the word defense too provocative. And will you dare publish it? No, he said gravely, I will not. You are all exactly the same, I continued after a short pause. Alone amongst yourselves you are defiantly confident, but out in the open or faced with others your courage evaporates. Deep down you know quite well that the censure heaped on you is perfectly justified. You protest eloquently in low voices, but when it comes to speaking up, you shirk it. It is true that the cause lacks martyrs. Don't use such big words. I use the words needed. We have had Wilde, Krupp, MacDonald, Eulenberg, as if that were not enough for you. Oh, victims. Victims as many as you please, but not a single martyr. They all deny it. They always will deny it. And there you are. They all feel ashamed and retract as soon as they are faced with public opinion, the press, or the courtroom. Or, alas, commit suicide. Yes, you are right. To try and establish one's innocence by disavowing one's life is to yield to public opinion. How strange. One has the courage of one's opinions, but not of one's habits. One can accept suffering, but not dishonor. By withholding publication of your book, aren't you the same as the others? He hesitated a moment and then said, Perhaps I shall not withhold it. Can you conceive what your attitude would be if in court you were cornered by a Queensberry or a Harden? Yes, unfortunately. Like those before me, I should be put out of countenance and deny everything. Our lives are never so isolated that the mud flung at us will not, at the same time, splatter others who are dear to us. The scandal would break my mother's heart. I would never forgive myself. My young sister lives with her and is not yet married. Perhaps it would be hard to find someone who would accept me as his brother-in-law. Ah, I catch your meaning. You are admitting that these habits bring disgrace even to those who do no more than tolerate them. It is not an admission, it is a statement, and that is exactly why I think the cause needs martyrs. Well, what do you mean by martyr? Someone who would lead the attack, who would accept, without bluster or boasting, all the odium and insults, or better still, someone whose courage, integrity, and uprightness were so incontestable that the most confirmed denouncers would hesitate. You will never find such a man. Let us hope he will appear. Listen, between ourselves, do you think there would be the slightest use in it? What change of opinion can you expect? You, I admit, are fairly restrained, but believe me, it would be better if you were even more so. These appalling habits would then quite naturally cease, and would not reappear again. I noticed him shrug his shoulders, but that did not deter me from continuing. Don't you think there is enough wickedness already exhibited in the world? I have been told that homosexuals find here and there shameful facilities, that they derive satisfaction from these hidden facilities and from the compliance of other homosexuals. Don't try to solicit the approval or even the indulgence of honest people on their behalf. It is precisely the esteem of honest people that I cannot afford to overlook. What can you do about it? Change your habits. I cannot change them. That was the dilemma of Krupp, MacDonald, and many others, and the revolver was their only solution. Luckily, you are less tragic. I could not swear to that. Anyway, I would like to write my book. You must admit that there is a certain element of conceit in your attitude. None at all. You cultivate your eccentricities, and then, to avoid any feeling of guilt, you congratulate yourself that you are different from the rest. Once again he shrugged his shoulders and paced the room without saying a word. Then, having apparently overcome the impatience which my last words aroused, he continued. 2. Not long ago, he said, sitting down beside me, we were good friends, and knew how to understand one another. Is it really necessary for you now to retort ironically to everything I say? I'm not asking for your approval, but since I am speaking in good faith, could you not listen in good faith? Then I could at least feel that you were listening to me in the same spirit that I was talking to you." "Forgive me," I said, disarmed by his tone of voice. "It is true that I have lost touch with you. Yes, we were fairly close friends before your behavior was affected by your inclinations. Then you stopped seeing me, or, to be honest, you broke with me. Let's not look for explanations. Let's talk as we used to," I said, holding out my hand. "I have time to listen. When we knew each other, you were still a student. Did you already understand yourself then? Tell me. I want to know the truth." He turned to me with a new expression of confidence and began, "During my time as a house surgeon at the hospital, I was plunged into a state of the greatest confusion when I came to realize my anomaly. It is absurd to maintain, as some people still do, that homosexuality is only the result of dissipation, or that it is simply an addiction of the blasé. I could not see myself as either degenerate or sick. Hard-working and completely chaste, I lived with the firm intention, when I finished my time in hospital, of marrying a girl, since dead, whom I then loved above all else in the world. My love was too great for me to realize clearly that I had no physical desire for her. There are people I know who maintain that the one can exist without the other, but this did not occur to me. Moreover, I had never loved any other woman, either spiritually or physically. The prostitutes, whom most of my friends pursued, were even less of a temptation to me. But since at that time I scarcely suspected that I might find attraction elsewhere, or that genuine attraction could even exist elsewhere, I persuaded myself that my abstention was a virtue. I prided myself on the idea of remaining a virgin until marriage. I idealized the purity that I was unable to think of as a delusion. It was only slowly that I came to understand myself, and finally I had to admit that the temptations which I flattered myself on resisting had really no attraction for me. What I had held to be virtue was really nothing but indifference. This was an appallingly humiliating fact for a young and high-minded person to accept. Only by hard work did I succeed in overcoming the melancholy which darkened and discolored my life. I soon persuaded myself that I was unsuited for marriage, and being unable to tell my fiancée the reasons for my sadness, my attitude towards her became more and more equivocal and embarrassed. Furthermore, the experiences that I then decided to try in a brothel proved to me conclusively that I was not impotent, while at the same time they served finally to convince me. Convince you of what? My case seemed so extraordinary, for how was I to know that it was common? I saw myself capable of sexual activity, but I believed I was incapable of, so to speak, sexual desire. Born of extremely healthy parents, I was physically robust. My appearance did nothing to betray my misery. None of my friends suspected it. I would rather have died than let anyone know. But this farce of cheerfulness, which I felt obliged to play in order to avoid suspicion, became eventually unbearable. As soon as I was alone, I relapsed into despondency. I was deeply impressed by the seriousness and conviction in his voice. "You read too much into this," I said quietly. "You are simply in love, and therefore full of anxieties. Your love would have developed quite naturally into physical desire as soon as you were married. I know people say so, but how right I was to be skeptical. There is little trace of the hypochondriac about you now. How did you cure yourself?" At that time I was reading a lot, and in the course of my reading I came across a sentence which gave me some sound advice. It was from the Abbé Galliani. "The important thing," he wrote to Madame d'Épinay, "the important thing is not so much to be cured as to learn to live with one's sickness." Why don't you tell that to your parents? I do, to those who are incurable. No doubt these words seem simple enough to you, but I drew my whole philosophy from them. It only remained for me to realize that I was not a freak, a unique case, for me to recover my self-assurance and escape from my self-hatred. You have explained how you came to realize your lack of interest in women, but not how your other inclinations. That is a rather painful story, and I do not like to tell it. However, I think you will listen sympathetically, and perhaps the story will help you to treat these matters less lightly. I reassured him, if not of my sympathy, then at least of my respectful attention. You already know, he began, that I was engaged. I loved the girl whom I intended to marry tenderly, but with a love that was almost mystical, and naturally, with my lack of experience, I scarcely imagined that any other kind of real love could exist. My fiancé had a brother a few years younger, whom I often saw and who formed a strong affection for me. "Aha!" I exclaimed involuntarily. Corydon looked up sharply. "No, nothing improper took place between us. His sister was my fiancée." "Forgive me." But you can imagine my consternation when one evening we were talking and he made it quite apparent that he wanted more than my friendship. Like most children, surely. They all require a little tenderness, but it is up to us who are older to respect that. I can assure you that I did respect it. However, Alexis was no longer a child. He was an intelligent and perceptive boy. But what was doubly disconcerting for me was that he showed such extraordinary and precocious insight in describing his own feelings that I felt he was making my own confession. Nothing, however, could possibly justify my severity. Severity? Yes, I was thoroughly scared. I spoke severely, almost harshly, and what was even worse, I spoke with the greatest contempt for what I called his effeminacy, which was in fact nothing but the natural expression of his affection. It is as well to handle such cases with delicacy. I used so little delicacy that the poor child, yes, he was only a kid, took my words tragically to heart. For 3 days he strove, by redoubled efforts of friendliness, to overcome what he took to be my anger. But I exaggerated my coldness towards him, to such an extent that— "Yes? What? Don't you know that Alexis B. killed himself?" "Are you trying to suggest that—" "Oh, I am suggesting nothing. At first they spoke of an accident. We were in the country at the time. The body was found at the foot of a cliff. An accident? What was I to believe? But here is the letter which I found on my bed." He opened a drawer with an unsteady hand, glanced at the letter, and then said, "No, I shall not read it to you. You would misjudge the boy. He told me in the most moving terms of the agony into which he had been thrown by our last conversation, particularly certain of my expressions. 'You can only save yourself from this,' I had cried, hypocritically indignant at the feelings he had confessed to me. 'You can only be saved by means of a great love.' 'Alas,' he wrote, 'I feel that love for you, my friend. You have not understood me, or, what is worse, you have understood and have despised me for it. I see I am becoming an object of disgust to you, as indeed I am becoming to myself. If I cannot change my awful nature, I can at least suppress it.' Then 4 more pages of pathetic writing, which, on account of his age, was a little pompous, and which afterwards it is so easy to belittle as simply declamatory. This speech made me feel a little uncomfortable. It was obviously, I said at last, a malicious trick of fate for such a declaration of love to be addressed to you in particular, and I can well understand how the episode must have upset you, to such an extent that I immediately gave up all thought of marrying my friend's sister. But, I persisted, I am convinced that people only get what they deserve. You must admit that if this boy had not sensed in you some possible echo of his own guilty passion, then his passion, perhaps some obscure instinct did make him aware of it, but in that case it was a pity that it did not make me aware of it too. If you had been aware of it, what would you have done? I believe I would have cured the boy. You said a moment ago that it was incurable. You quoted the words of the abbé. The important thing is not so much to be cured. I could have cured him as I have cured myself. And how is that? By persuading him he was not sick. Now, tell me his perversion was natural. By persuading him that there was nothing unnatural in his deviation. And if it had persisted, you would naturally have yielded to it. Ah, that is an entirely different question. When the physiological problem is resolved, the moral problem begins. Out of consideration for his sister, I would certainly have urged him to conquer his feelings, in the same way that I would have conquered my own. At least his love would have lost the monstrous appearance which it had assumed in his eyes. This drama, by opening my own eyes to my true character and by showing me the nature of my affection for this boy, this drama, on which I meditated so long, finally determined my attitude towards the thing you find so despicable. Remembering this victim, I wanted to help other victims suffering from the same misunderstanding. I wanted to cure them in the way that I have told you. 3. Now, I think you will appreciate why I want to write this book. The only serious books on the subject, to my knowledge, are certain medical works which, from the opening pages, reek unbearably of the clinic. Then you do not intend to write as a doctor? As doctor, naturalist, moralist, sociologist, historian? I was not aware you were so versatile. What I mean to say is that I shall not claim to write about it as a specialist, but as a man. Usually the doctors who deal with the subject are concerned only with homosexuals who feel ashamed, the pitiful, the plaintive, the inverted, the sick. Only these resort to doctors. As a doctor myself, I have to attend such people, but as a man I come across others who are neither pitiful nor complaining. It is these that I wish to study. The normal homosexuals. Exactly! You must understand that in homosexuality, as in heterosexuality, there are all shades and degrees, from platonic love to lust, from self-denial to sadism, from healthy joy to moroseness, from natural development to all the refinements of vice. And between exclusive homosexuality and exclusive heterosexuality, there is every intermediate shade. It is usual, however, to make a clear-cut distinction between normal love and love which is allegedly unnatural, and for convenience to attribute to the one all the unhappiness, all the noble and tragic passions, all the splendor of spirit, and all heroic achievement, whilst loading on the other all the foul dregs of... Now, don't let yourself get carried away. Sapphism is not altogether unrecognized amongst us. He was so worked up that he did not hear my remark and continued. There is no spectacle more grotesque at each new trial for a moral offense than the righteous astonishment of the newspapers at the virile appearance of the accused. Evidently, the public expected to see them in skirts. Look, I cut this out of the journal at the time of the C.R.D.N. trial. He searched amongst some documents and handed me a sheet of paper, where the following was underlined. The Count de Oenau, tall, well-dressed and dignified, does not give the slightest impression of being an effeminate man. He is the typical example of the Guards officer, proud of his profession, and yet this man, with his splendid military appearance, is suspected of the gravest offence. The Count de Linard, a handsome man also, etc. In the same way, he continued, MacDonald and Eulenberg seemed, even to the most prejudiced observers, intelligent, handsome, dignified. In fact, very attractive men. He stopped for a moment, and I noticed a look of scorn on his face. But recovering quickly, he continued as though he had not caught my meaning. One could rightly expect the person loved to be attractive, but not necessarily the person who loves. The appearance of these people does not affect me. If I insist on physical appearances, then it is only because of the significant fact that they are healthy and virile. I do not claim that all homosexuals are. Homosexuality, like heterosexuality, has its degenerates, its vicious, and its sick. Like most of my fellow doctors, I have come across many pitiful, painful, and dubious cases. But I will spare my readers. As I have said already, my book will deal with healthy homosexuality, or as you expressed it just now, with normal homosexuality. Didn't you realize that I was using the phrase mockingly? You would be delighted if I had to concede this first point. I shall never ask you to concede anything out of kindness. I would rather you were forced to do so. Now it is your turn to joke. I am not joking. I don't mind betting that within 20 years it will be impossible to take words like unnatural and perverted at all seriously. There is only one thing in the world that I admit is not natural, a work of art. Everything else, whether one likes it or not, belongs to the natural order. And since we are no longer regarding it from a moralist's point of view, it is best to consider it from a naturalist's. These words that you are challenging are at least useful in strengthening our moral customs. Where should we be if you were to eliminate them? We should not be more amoral. In fact, I have to restrain myself from adding, on the contrary, you heterosexuals are magnificent humbugs. Listening to some of you talk, one would gather that for a relationship to be licit, or at any rate normal, it is only necessary for it to be between people of different sexes. It is sufficient if the relationship is potentially normal, but homosexuals are of necessity depraved. Do you really imagine that they know nothing of self-control and self-denial? It is, of course, lucky that they are restrained to some extent by our laws and by a certain sense of respectability. And it is, of course, lucky for you that our laws and conventions restrain you so little. I am losing my patience. We have marriage, good, honest marriage, which is more than you have. You make me feel like one of those moralists who regard all pleasures of the flesh as sinful, except those of marriage, and who disapprove of any relationship that is not legally sanctioned. Oh, I can tell them a thing or two about that, and if driven to it, can be as uncompromising as they are. I've been called on as a doctor to probe into a considerable number of marital relationships, very few of which, I can assure you, were spotless, and I would certainly not like to wager that more ingenuity in the mechanics of love, or perversions if you prefer, is to be found amongst professional prostitutes than amongst certain honest couples. You are revolting. But if the bed is a marriage bed, then vice is immediately whitewashed. Married couples can do what they like. That is permissible. Anyway, it is none of your business. Permissible. Yes, I prefer that word to normal. I had been warned that you people possessed a strangely distorted moral sense, but I had no idea it was as bad as this. You seem to be overlooking completely the natural act of procreation, which marriage sanctifies and by which the great mystery of life is perpetuated. And once that is achieved, the act of love becomes an unlicensed intoxication, nothing but a gratuitous fantasy, a game. Ah, no, I am not overlooking it. In fact, I intend to base my theories on its inescapable conclusions. Apart from the demands of procreation, there remains nothing but the pleasure principle. But remember that the act of procreation is rare, and that once every 10 months is sufficient. That is very little, especially when the natural urge requires an infinitely greater outlet, and I hardly dare finish my sentence. Go on, you have said so much already. All right, then. I maintain that the act of procreation in nature, so far from being the only natural factor, is, to a disconcerting degree, usually nothing but a fluke. Good God. Explain yourself. Willingly. But at this point we come to natural history, with which my book begins and from which I approach my subject. If you have the patience, I shall explain it to you. Come back tomorrow. By then, I shall have put my papers in order.